Whether you're following along with our Stowe Sew Along or want to make your own bias tape for another project, this tutorial is for you. In this lesson, I'll walk you through the steps involved in cutting and folding your own bias tape as we do it here in the studio. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below. To begin, I first want to discuss what bias tape is, but before we do that, let's go back one step further and talk about bias. Bias is any grain line that falls between the straight grain and cross grain of the fabric. When cutting bias tape, we'll be cutting our fabric along the true bias, which falls at a 45-degree angle to the cross and straight grains. Because the bias cuts across the straight and cross grains, it's much stretchier without the full length of the threads to stabilize it. And this stretch makes bias binding perfect for rounding curves like necklines or bag handles. Now, what turns bias into bias tape? We'll be cutting strips of fabric on the bias and folding them to create bias binding. Most patterns call for double fold bias binding, which means the fabric is folded twice to create the binding. This is in contrast to single fold binding, which is only folded once. You can see here in this image the difference between the two. Single fold bias binding can absolutely be used in place of double fold, but keep in mind to make sure that the tape will be the right size once you apply it to your finished project. Now that we know what bias binding is, let's talk about how to make it. To begin, we'll need to cut our bias strips. We'll be cutting along the true bias, which falls at a 45-degree angle from the selvage edge. Our end product in this tutorial is double fold bias tape with a 1/4 inch finished width. So we'll be cutting 1-inch wide strips, though you'll also see how single fold bias tape is made along the way. As a general rule, for double fold bias binding, you want your strips to be 4 times as wide as the width of the finished bias tape. I've found that the easiest way to cut my strips are to use a rotary mat, a rotary ruler, and a rotary cutter. The mat, you want to keep your rotary from cutting your table. A rotary ruler is a really thick, hard plastic. If you use a thin ruler, your rotary cutter can actually cut through it, but this has a really thick edge that allows the blade to run smoothly past it without cutting it. And you're going to want to make sure you have a new blade in your rotary cutter. You'll also need your fabric. So to begin, you're going to take your fabric and you're going to lay it out so that the selvage edge, that's the finished edge, aligns with the 0 point on your rotary mat. And then I'm just going to weight this down a little bit so it doesn't move while I'm demoing, but you don't need to do that. Then you're going to take your rotary ruler, and it should have a cross down at the bottom. So here it has 45-degree angle for the true bias. We're going to align that with the bottom edge of the fabric. And I'm not starting down at the corner here because you're just going to have really small pieces that have a lot of seams. So you can see I'm starting up a bit. So take your rotary cutter, expose the blade, and hold your hold your ruler. And then just cut. I'm going to remove this, and you can see we now have a straight line on the true bias. So now again, we're cutting 1-inch strips. So you're going to align your ruler. Cut, and then mine doesn't quite go to the top. So I just scoot it up and continue cutting. So here we have 1 strip of bias. We're going to set that aside and keep cutting until you have enough strips to equal the yardage of bias binding that you'll need. Okay, one public service announcement. You can see I'm now wearing a bandage. I cut myself with the rotary, so be very careful. It's so sharp. I didn't even feel it cut, and now I'm bleeding everywhere. Now that we have all of our bias strips cut, we need to join them together. So to do that, you're going to pull out 2 of the strips, take your 2 bias strips, and lay one with the right side facing up. Then take the other, and with the wrong side facing up, you're going to lay it on top of the other strip like this. So you have this little triangle formed. You'll have these angled edges from cutting the bias strips, so you shouldn't need to cut those. You can see we have the edges of the 2 strips aligned so that the seam allowance, when we sew them together, is 1/4 inch. So when we sew from this point to this point, it's going to be 1/4 inch, and you can see it's aligned with the 1/4 inch. Now we'll stitch across that seam line. You don't need to pin before you sew, but if you're worried about keeping the edges lined up, feel free to pop a pin in there. All right, so here we are at the machine. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot because that's also my seam allowance, so it just makes everything really easy. And you can see right here, this V where the 2 strips meet is exactly aligned with my needle. So I'm just going to start sewing. I do not back tack on this because it just kind of ends up eating the edges. All right, so here you can see our strip is sewn together with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you unfold it, it makes a solid piece. So we need to continue doing this with all of our strips. So to sew the next one on, what I do is I have this top strip here. I just follow it to the end. And this is going to become the bottom piece, so we're going to flip it over. From there, we're going to take another strip. Line it up for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And sew across. And I like to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance because it's about the smallest seam allowance I feel comfortable going, and it allows me to get the most out of my strip. But it doesn't matter as long as you're sewing from one point to the other in a straight line. You can use any seam allowance. So this is 3/8. You can sew across there and it'll still open and be straight. So just work across until all of your strips are sewn together. All right, so here you can see we now have a giant long line of bias tape, and we're going to need to press our seams open. So let's head over to the iron. All right, now to press these seams open, I first like to just do a quick finger press because it's on the bias. I don't know, it's a thing I do. It seems to be easier for me. And just give it a little steam. And move on to the next one. And this is also a good time to check and make sure that all of your seams are sewn the right way. You don't have any seams falling to the right side of your binding. And our final seam. All right, and now here you can see we're left with these triangles that go over the edge. I just like to trim those off because I'm using a bias tape maker and I find that it goes through the maker more easily. So there you can see they're trimmed off. So just go through your tape and do that. Now we need to fold the bias tape. So I'll be using this Clover bias tape maker. What happens is you feed the fabric through this channel here and it comes out as a single fold piece of bias tape out this end. So it forces the fabric to wrap around. It's really a great tool. I have them in a bunch of different sizes and I use them all the time. So here is how that works. Take your end of your bias tape and you're going to just feed it in here like so. And you can see it comes out the end. You just give it a pull and you can see it's already folding. So now what you do is you press. You're going to cut off the end because it just never looks great. And so what I do is I take a pin. You want to make sure it either has a glass head or it's just a standard pin because we're going to be ironing near it. I like to anchor this point in place. Let me anchor it over here so we can get further across the camera. Then you're going to take your iron and you're just going to gently pull the bias tape maker along the strip. And I just want to note, this iron has some kind of cool steam or something, where I can steam and it's not hot. I don't know why or how. But if you're using a standard iron, you're going to want to keep your hand out of the way because you will burn yourself. So there you go. You can see we already have our single fold and we're just going to work our way across the entire bias strip. All right, now when you get to a seam, you're going to want to make sure it just goes through flat. And it's pretty easy, but just double check that. Put this back so I can press. You can see it's going to want to just fold back on itself, but that's going to create bulk we don't want, so make sure it's flat. It's going to give a little resistance when you pull it through, but just make sure you're not stretching the bias tape because it will stretch and then it will become narrower than you want. So just nice and gentle. Okay, so now what we have is single fold bias tape because it just has this one fold, the first fold. So to create double fold bias tape, we need to put that second fold in. So all we do is we take the two edges and align them and press. And you're just going to do that along the length of your strip. And then you have double fold bias tape. All right, so that is it. We have now created our own double fold bias binding. You can use your tape right away or wind it onto a piece of cardboard to stay neat for later. I'll be using this double fold bias binding for the Stowe Sew Along, but it's also great for finishing necklines, hems, and more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video has helped you step up your bias binding game. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of our video sewing lessons and tutorials.